This episode of the Policing Matters podcast is brought to you by LVT, the mobile surveillance solution trusted by public sector leaders nationwide. See how LVT's self-powered units protect communities, secure critical infrastructure, and support law enforcement operations at lvt.com. Hey, welcome back to Policing Matters, the podcast where we tackle the critical issues shaping up law enforcement today. I'm your host, Jim Dudley. Welcome back. Cops spend a lot of their careers calculating how long it is until retirement. But then when the day comes, the transition to being a civilian again can be so challenging. Well, check out the article in our show notes that addresses the fear, isolation, and sometimes sense of identity that officers have once they retire. Well, joining me today is Jason Cates. Jason Cates began his law enforcement career with the Oak Brook, Illinois Police Department in 1992 and rose through the ranks, promoted to sergeant in 2000, lieutenant in 2006, and deputy chief in 2012. Well, welcome to Policing Matters, Jason Cates.
Thank you very much, Jim. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I've looked at your own podcast and your work, your website. You wrote in response to this article that we posted on Police One by Sergeant Sean Furstenberg, and it was titled "The Silence After the Badge, a Sergeant's Blunt Truth About Retirement." And it really resonated with you and so many others. I think it got thousands of hits in a 24-hour period. And I wasn't aware of this because I feel like I had a really smooth transition from retirement to do things I really liked and enjoyed. And I still have contact with some of my old colleagues, but I know some people really struggle and they think, oh, I'll just get a job, a security job or at another department, and then things may not shape out. What really resonated with you personally?
I think it's when Sean talked about that loss of relevance or feeling that you've lost relevance, and the silence after you leave the job. And what's interesting is more than one person that I've sat down with and talked to speaks about the quiet. That they think they're all good, and once they leave the job, they experience that quiet, and that's when they start having some problems. So, for me personally, I experienced a loss of identity that, in some respects, I continue to struggle with a little bit. Right out of high school, I had the identity of a Marine. Right after the Marine Corps, I had the identity of a police officer, and now I'm just working on developing that identity of Jason, the retired guy, and it can be challenging, especially for so many guys when they look back and there's this feeling that the greatest contribution you've made in your life, the most you're ever going to do, is in the rearview mirror. It happened when you're a cop, and now you're a retired guy, and really they struggle with trying to find that sense of purpose. For 20 plus years, they were looked at as problem solvers, and now nobody's really looking at them to solve their problems for them anymore, and that can be a struggle for a lot of guys, and I can relate to it.
Yeah, I think Bruce Springsteen wrote a song about it. And friends of mine, we talk about when we talk about our old policing days, we talk about the longer it is, the better we were. So we had these
Yep.
grand ideas of these super cops that we were. Now you come from an agency that's about the same as 70% or more other agencies across America, just west of Chicago. I'm sure you had a lot of activity, great relationships in the sworn ranks, the civilian ranks, your community people. What do you miss the most?
You miss the relationships, right? When as a boss, I would have to say that probably my greatest regret is that I didn't spend more time on developing those personal connections with everybody top to bottom. Far too often, I got focused on projects and getting projects done and getting things off my list. And I didn't spend enough time developing those relationships, because it's those relationships that last when you leave the job. People talking about you, those projects, it's a stroke of a pen and those projects go away. And even if they stay, nobody's going to remember who created them or why they were created. So Probably my biggest regret is I wish I would have focused more on the people, because I'm finding that that's the thing that I miss the most is the people. That sense of camaraderie, the joking around at roll call, going car to car and solving the problems of the department, in a 30-minute period, and you just miss that. And really, that's that piece of the job that is so intangible and is really never even on your radar when you're thinking about retiring. It's all monetary. It's all the economics of it. Can I afford to go? Not what's going to be the social impact on me, and what's going to happen when I leave the job to those friendships, especially for those guys like me that leave the state. There is no stopping in for a cup of coffee. It makes it even that much harder to maintain those relationships.
Yeah, but I mean, knowing what I know about you already, I think you would have done that if you could, but the job really takes a lot out of you. And the more you move up the ranks, it's a pyramid, right? And it gets a little lonely at the top, and you've got to make some hard decisions and choose roles for officers that they may not really fancy all that much. And so, if you're going to do a really good job, you're going to make enemies. I think the most ineffective leaders that I saw in the department were those that were just so resistant to, um, making people feel bad or, getting on the wrong side of people. And they were ineffective because they wouldn't take the hard line when they really should have. And so
Sure.
to do that really good job, you've got to like divorce yourself from some of those relationships, don't you?
To a degree, you do. And I always, guys on the department always knew that it was much harder to be my friend because I held you to a higher standard, because we had that friendship, and I didn't ever want somebody to think that I was playing favorites
Mhm.
and that they were getting by. So, but you're right. It's far more important to be respected than to be liked, and that was really how I approached the job. At least when you're in a leadership position, you have to have the respect of the guys. You want to be consistent so they know what to expect from you, and you want to be seen as fair. But that's not to say I couldn't have found a way to work harder on developing relationships, because so often you have those people that you can rely on to get the job done for you, and those are the ones that you invest heavily in, and you often overlook those others that maybe could be brought into the tent if you just set aside the time to interact with them a little bit. So I do wish I could have done that. I appreciate you being so kind and recognizing that it is challenging, and that oftentimes doing the job is more important, that you're going to bruise some feelings every once in a while.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. Hey, what was your experience leading up to retirement? So this article, and I urge everyone listening or watching to read that article because it really resonated with so many. I saw some of the comments that said, "This guy's right on. I felt completely this way. I didn't know what to do. I tried this, I tried that." What was the hardest part for you hanging up your uniform for the last time? You talked about your relationships and your identity a little bit. Tell me more about that.
So for me, quite honestly, it was a very unique experience. I retired in January of 2021. So, I mean, I guess you could say at the tail end of COVID, but nobody really knew when it was gonna wind down officially, especially in Illinois. There were a lot of measures put in place by the governor that really limited what you could and couldn't do. So the community that I worked in was completely sales tax based, no property tax. And they were looking at some budget shortfalls. So they were trying to figure out how they could reduce expenditures. And one of the ways to do that, your biggest expenditure is salaries. So there's a component in the law in Illinois that allows you to buy military time up to 2 years. So the village knew that I was under 2 years to maxing out on my retirement time. So they made the offer to buy me out. And it was a Tuesday night phone call after a board meeting. The chief called me and he said, "You're never going to believe that." So retiring's not on my radar. I've got 19 months to go before I'm maxed out on the pension. And I never intended on leaving before that. So I get the phone call. He says, "You're never going to believe this. They want to know what that buyout figure is." And honestly, it was like a punch in the gut. And for a split second, I didn't know if I should tell my wife, because I knew what my wife was going to say. And I knew if I told her that I was going to be retiring. But I knew it was a decision that we had to make together. And so there was no plan in place for me. That was mid December. And 3 weeks later, I'm walking out the door of the police department. And 11 months later, I've moved out of the state. So there was no preparing for me. And I think I know that's what makes it harder, because I've talked to a lot of guys, uh, interviewed a lot of guys on the YouTube channel that separated as a result of workers' comp injuries.
Mm.
And these are severe injuries, and they had no plan in place. They weren't expecting it. And quite honestly, those are the officers that take it the hardest. And my heart goes out to them, because I know as a boss, when you're dealing with workers' comp cases, all you want to do is get it closed out and get their replacement in as quick as possible, especially in a smaller department, because you can't absorb that loss, and never really realized what those officers were going through on the backside. I talked to one, and everything I share is on the YouTube channel. Scott Meyerhofer talked about his house was going into foreclosure, and he couldn't even get guys in the department to talk to him because they thought he was running a scam. Another, Jennifer Markowski, suffers a traumatic brain injury, and she's got guys on her department making jokes about her injury, and how it's not severe, and it's horrible how we treat those officers. Um, that 1% of officers who are running a scam do ruin it for the 99% who are legitimately injured and can't come back. And it's those officers that have the hardest time with the separation. And that was kind of the spot that I found myself in. And, I was a little bit fortunate, because I rolled right into an interim chief's job for a little while. And then I rolled into consulting for a while. So the silence didn't really hit me for maybe 2.5 years. And then it was at that 2.5 year mark where I started questioning, holy smokes, did I make the right decision? Should I retire? At the time, I figured I was ready to go. But when I look back, I was 50. I could have easily done another 5 years. So then you start questioning that decision. But it was a complete surprise, unplanned. I didn't have anything in place. I was fortunate to roll into some things. But eventually that quiet comes. And it's when that quiet comes that you start struggling with your identity a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. And so you did a couple things for a couple of years, and then you said, I got to tell some stories because, were they pent up in you? You created My Journey with the Badge, your blog and your podcast. How'd you get into that?
So, because I am over 50, I joke when you're over 50, it's a federal law that you got to watch YouTube. And so there's this channel. I'm going to tip my hat to him because he does an awesome job. Urban Valor. And he sits down with veterans, whether you were in for 2 years or 20 years or 30 years. And he has them tell their story, from the decision to join the military to the decision to leave the military and everything that happened in between. And when I was listening to these stories, I was realizing how similar, I was in the military. I knew there were some similarities, but what I didn't realize is the psychology of it, of
Mm.
being in the military and being a police officer. It is so similar. And I think the major difference that I've come across is that in the military, you have veterans that experience acute periods of trauma. And in law enforcement, it's this cumulative trauma that builds up over 25, 30 years. And it just builds and builds and builds. And when you leave law enforcement or you leave the military, um, you're left trying to manage it all on your own. And so when I would listen to these stories, I felt that there was an opportunity. I checked, there was nothing out there that was giving officers the opportunity, retired officers, the opportunity to sit down and share the stories of their career. So I thought, man, what a great way to stay involved. Kind of a tip of my hat to those officers, and giving them the platform to not only share their stories, but share a piece of law enforcement history. I talked to one guy, Gary Graytop, who was a Detroit cop in the 60s and 70s. Talk about a different way of doing policing. This is before speed loaders existed. The guy carried a revolver and extra rounds in his pocket. I mean, so there's so much to learn from this, and some of the stories. There's the entertaining stories, And there's definitely the heartfelt stories, the stories involving kids. I mean, they just tug at your heartstrings. And I really don't think, cops get enough credit for what they experience and how they have to carry that with them for the rest of their lives. It amazes me that some have been able to carry what they carry with them for so long and have it not destroy their lives.
Yeah, and some cops are willing to tell their story, others are reluctant, and you've got it's almost a Q and A with them to hear the details. I remember this guy I was riding with him. We weren't regular partners, and he was like, he pointed to this shop on the street in San Francisco, and he said, "Oh, there's that guy tried to shoot me in that shop." And then we kept driving. I'm like, "Well, and?" Because, "Oh, I shot him." And that's how the story went, right? You had to pull the details out of this guy.
Yeah.
You've probably got law enforcement officers reaching out to you who want to tell your story. How's that working? Is there a theme that you're recognizing or you're seeing that, maybe the story's slightly different, but the theme is the same?
So I will tell you, this is the one thing I had no idea how challenging it was going to be. Probably the most difficult thing is to get guys to sit down and share their stories. Honestly, 90% of it's word of mouth.
Mm.
A matter of fact, I just had a guy from episode 2 reach out to me and say, "Hey, I got a guy on my bowling league I was telling about your channel." And that's a year ago that he sat down with me and he gave me a referral. I talked to a guy from LAPD on the phone. I talked to far more on the phone than I actually sit down and interview. And I talked to him and he said, "I've been told my whole career never to talk to the media." And it's like, hey, I'm not the media. I'm just a cop trying to help you tell your story. But I think it makes sense that so many of us get that in our mindset of, I've always been told not to talk to the media, don't talk to the media. So these guys are hesitant there to share their story from that perspective. And also, I think the bigger piece is you get so many guys that they don't want to go back there. They don't want to open that box up again, right? They walk out the door and it's a two-way street. Guys talk about, "Oh, my department has never reached out to me the day I left." My question to them is always, "Well, how many times have you reached out to them?" And it's kind of this mutual thing of where guys don't want to go back there, quite honestly, because I think it hurts. It hurts to not be a part of that anymore. So it's been really challenging getting guys to sit down and do the interviews. I try and help them as much as possible. I give them the questions in advance so they know that here's what the topics are going to be. But you're right, it is difficult to get guys to tell the stories. The phrase that I've never heard so much until I started sitting down and doing this is long story short. No, 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 no short stories here. I want to hear the details. So, and you never know when to push more and go deeper because you don't know if they're prepared for that. But one of the things I can tell you is I was up in Chicago doing some interviews last weekend, and I got a text from one of the guys, and he used the term healing, cathartic, and it's not the first time I've heard it. Is that just having the opportunity? When's anybody sit down with you as a police officer and say, "Hey, tell me all about your career from your decision to become a cop to a decision to retire and everything in between?" You don't get that opportunity. And so when guys sit down and they do that, I can't tell you how many guys afterwards they're like, "Holy smoke," they get very emotional and they tell me, "Holy smokes, I had no idea that was like one guy giving CPR to a baby that drowned." And he's telling the story and he breaks down and he tells me, he said, "That was 20 plus years ago. I had no idea that was still there, that level of emotion." So for many of them, it's kind of closure in a weird way. But the best part, the reason I think that it helps to serve as a closure for some of them, is the feedback that they get from the people that they worked with. So many guys, they tell me, "Oh, I've heard from people I haven't heard from in 15 years, 10 years." The guys reach out to them and say, "Hey, I saw your video. That was awesome. That was great. I didn't know that." One of the guys that I sat down with, Dave Franklin, he's in the jurisdiction next door to me when I was on the job. And some of the stories he told, this guy works next door to me. I had no idea he went through the stuff that he went through.
Mhm.
So it's incredibly insightful to sit down with these guys and hear their stories. And when you ask what the common thread is, I think the common thread is there's a tremendous amount of passion for the job. 90% of the guys miss the job, and that 10%, I think they're going to miss it. They just haven't hit it yet. And the majority of the guys, they're carrying around some trauma that it just hasn't been treated yet. And I don't think they've recognized it. And really, they haven't had their attention brought to it until they sit down and have the discussions with me and tell their stories.
Yeah. No, I mean, I find that true too. I talk to a lot of cops on the show. Some of them have gone on to other agencies or to academic careers where they're doing research, and it's great. And I think what you're saying is that a lot of guys, a lot of men and women are carrying around a lot of this accumulated trauma, vicarious trauma, stuff they saw, something they've heard, and they're not getting help and they're just carrying around. I found I was in a fatal shooting. I told this to somebody the other day and they said, uh, yeah, which side were you on? I'm like, hello, I'm here. but uh, but early on in my career after the shooting, it was tough for me to talk about, but I've talked about it so often now. I do, it sounds cliche, but I do feel like it does lose some of its power. I mean, I feel my physical reactions when I tell the story, if I get into the details. And I mean, that happened 25 years ago or more. And, I think we could all benefit from sitting down to people we trust and telling those stories. And maybe you'll realize something every time you tell the story. Maybe you'll realize something different. Maybe it will lose power over time. Uh, you know, in that article, I keep referring to that article that we're talking about, but the sergeant says, he went to try to get help somewhere, and they said, "Yeah, sorry, it's only for active officers." And I was like, you know, we talk about presumptive injuries, lower back from carrying a gun belt, or if you're a firefighter, smoke inhalation and you're cardiopulmonary, and all these other presumptive injuries, even some cancers now. Like, why don't we have psych trauma help after we retire? And even if you don't discover it until 10 years after you retire, that should be available. And I hope, and I'd love to hear if anybody's at an agency that does that. I'd love to hear from them because that's something I think we should be doing universally so that people can get help that they might
A,
need.
a couple of things, if I could, Jim, on that
Yeah.
point. So that was one of the guys that I talked to who worked out in California.
Hmm.
Um, Loved his agency. He was in a command staff position, had a great relationship with the city. He left and retired. And shortly after retiring, he noticed that he was constantly getting into arguments with his wife that had never happened before. And it comes to a point where he says, "What's wrong with you?" And she says, "What's wrong with me? What's wrong with you?" And he said it took some time for it to sink in. And he didn't know where to go or what to do. And he went back to his agency and he said, "Hey, I don't know what to do." And this is some months later. He says, I don't know what to do. Can you maybe give me an EAP referral, just a place to start?" And that was their response to him of, "Well, we can't give you an EAP referral. You're not an employee." And I get it, but we gotta figure out a way to do better. We know what the divorce rate is pretty closely for active duty cops. We know what the suicide rate is for active duty cops. We know the same for veterans. We have no idea how bad the problem is once cops leave the job. We don't know what the divorce rate is for cops when they leave the job. We don't know what the suicide rate is for cops when they leave the job. We know for the military tracks it for their guys when they become veterans through the VA administration. They track all of that information, but nobody's tracking it for us. So we don't even know how bad the problem is. I talked to Cheryl Franklin. I've talked to a couple of wives on the podcast. I talked to Cheryl Franklin, who's Dave Franklin's wife, who I had interviewed earlier, mentioned I interviewed earlier. And she said that she actually had to go to her agency, her husband's agency, and after he was involved in an incident, said, "He's not ready to go back. You can't listen to him. He's not ready." And the incident that he was involved in, he ever never actually got help for it until she threatened to take the kids and divorce him.
Wow.
And she said, "This is the first time I'm sharing this with anybody. I don't even think my parents know." And what it caused me to realize is it isn't just the officer that we need to find a way to do a better job helping. It's the family. And I don't know anybody that's looking at the family, but you know, by we're putting those officers by being their employer, we're putting those officers in those situations where they're experiencing that trauma. They're taking that trauma home to their families. We're doing a better job of trying to help the officer, but the families, we're not even putting them on the paper. We have no idea what's going on at home. So from top to bottom, we need to figure out a way to do things better. I don't know what the answer is. I just know that in sitting down and talking to these officers that we've got guys and girls out there that are hurting, and we owe it to them to try and help them through that.
Yeah, you bring up a great point. I wish agencies did reach out to their retired people. I mean, sometimes all you get is a kick in the face. Our retirement firearms requalifications to maintain our CCWs, they stopped giving them, they stopped allowing them for retirees at my old agency. And so now you got to go hunt down somebody that'll requalify you, and then you go through this process of going through personnel. So for an agency to reach out, send a card every year. How you doing? Fill out this questionnaire, go to this link. What can we do for you? God, that'd be great, wouldn't it?
For sure. That agency where I was interim chief at, I was there for 10 months at the most. Every year I get a Christmas card from them with a letter updating on what's going on at the department. That's awesome. And
Yeah.
sometimes that's all it takes, to your point. It's you still feel included.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome. Hey, I want to ask you some more about your show and the people you're talking to, but I want to take a quick word from our sponsor. LVT's solar powered mobile surveillance units put eyes and AI analytics where fixed cameras can't: parking lots, remote borders, disaster zones, and large events. Agencies using LVT have seen up to an 83% drop in parking lot incidents and a 54% reduction in burglaries. Each unit is rapid to deploy, cloud connected via cellular or satellite, and secured end to end so your team can monitor and respond in real time with fewer resources. Put LVT to test at your toughest location. Schedule a free trial today at lvt.com. I'm speaking with Jason Cates, retired deputy chief, and behind my journey with the badge. Jason, I'm a broken record here. I want to talk about that article that we began to talk with at the beginning of the show. And these responders are saying they retire, there's the loneliness, the loss of identity, a loss of belonging to a group. What do you hear? What are they saying? I mean, me personally, I know that there's a lot of guys that'll just walk off the job and never look back, and that's their choice. But there's so many opportunities to give back. You found a niche. I found my niche 8 years ago. I teach a couple of classes at our regional police academy. I teach at university, and we could use some experience and history for the new people coming in. What do you say to this malaise of, gosh, I'm here by myself. What could I do?
You kind of said it. You got to find your niche, and I don't know what the answer is for everybody, but I believe that if it's law enforcement adjacent, that's pretty helpful. It's, you talk about PTSD, and after World War II, that 2 week cruise coming back to the United States, and it was that 2 weeks that gave them that decompression. I think finding something that puts you law enforcement adjacent, it kind of gives you that ability to maintain that contact, still be a part of the community, but not be, pushing a squad car around every day. And really, that's what I see so many people going back and doing. Even guys that relocate from other states here to Tennessee, they end up, doing court security, working at the college. There's so many other jobs that they can do, and it's very difficult to give up that community. And I don't know how you do it cold turkey, but I think that what guys are missing more than anything is that, for lack of a better term, that fraternal component.
Hmm.
And there's so many ways to find that in your community, whether it's the Moose Lodge or VFW or something, just that sense of belonging to something, and having that camaraderie. It's never going to be the same as being a cop. That's just the reality of it. But it creates that opportunity to form some new bonds. And some guys, again, Downers Grove Police Department is a perfect example. They do a breakfast where it's just the retired guys getting together once a month. They do a breakfast. All the retired guys get together and they share stories and they kind of bond. And that's that group that kind of keeps them connected. If you have that, that's awesome. If you don't, maybe there's an opportunity to create something like that. I've started doing that here in Tennessee through a Facebook page of just setting up a breakfast, every month or so. And anybody that's available to come, we come and we get together and we sit down and we kind of tell stories. And I'm amazed. I'll tell you, so some of the guys that have it the hardest are these small department guys. When you sit down with these departments that are less than 10 guys and you hear their stories, holy smokes, a small department doesn't mean less work by any means. It's just some
Sure.
of the stuff that they do, but you get to share those stories. And that's the one thing that I could recommend is, find that community, whether it's a retired law enforcement group or some other fraternal group. Find that, and I think that that's going to do a lot to help you get through the quiet.
Yeah. And I mean, social media, I know a lot of cops, especially cops in our era, are not big social media people. And
True.
so to get them on a Facebook or something else like that, that's might be a challenge. But I mean, even going back to the community and joining, community groups and maybe, adding some of your expertise at your school or at a community event. And I was on our Parks Commission for 10 years and did some independent SEPTED studies of our parks to say, hey, man, this is overgrown. The lighting's terrible. Something bad's going to happen here unless we do something. And then every year I go to Oktoberfest and I pull beer for 4 hours a night. And you're giving beer to people and they're so happy. I mean, look for things, you'll find them. There are ways to be gratified and to give, without getting paid. It doesn't always have to end up with a paycheck. And for me, I'm blessed. We have a great retirement system here in San Francisco, so I can't complain. I know it's not great everywhere, but if you're feeling the ways that they're talking about in that article, you owe it to yourself to get out there and explore and try a couple things. Doesn't mean you have to do it all the time. Try it. If you don't like it, move on to something else.
I think what makes it the hardest is, guys. And when I say guys, I mean cops, male and
Sure.
female.
Yeah.
They're not anticipating it. Stop and think how long we set that goal of, on this date, this is my retirement. I'm walking out the door. You never think of what is that feeling going to be like when you're not putting that badge on anymore. And so it's not on their radar.
Mm.
So I think that that's the biggest thing, and I think that's one of the things that this article really does is it helps bring that to light for guys, and hopefully it puts it in front of their face, because it's not like that article said this is for retired guys only. I mean, and everybody reads that, goes to Police One and reads that stuff, and so hopefully it puts it on their radar where guys recognize, okay, this is a possibility. I've got to have a plan, and I think that's what was the hardest for me is it was unexpected, and I didn't really have a plan in place. But understand, even if you put that plan in place, that at some point, if you haven't dealt with your trauma, at some point when you get into that quiet space, that trauma may pop up, and I think that that's what's incredibly important, is finding a way to deal with that.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about it, but you brought up PTSD, and we're talking about mental health everywhere in law enforcement and public safety. While you're on the job, and much less after the job, what are some of the early warning signs that you think officers should watch for as they approach retirement? And like you mentioned earlier, you know, you may be thinking you're just fine, but you need to confide in family members or close friends to say, give me a 30-second or 5-minute assessment. How do you think I'm doing?
I think the peer support programs that are outside of your agency, where you're not talking to somebody in your department, but you're talking with somebody that's maybe gone through some
Hmm.
trauma or a substance abuse problem, whether it's alcohol or disciplinary issues. We know that just simple disciplinary issues can just, you know, send a guy down a bad path where all of a sudden, the department's out to get me. So having the ability to talk to somebody outside the agency that understands the world of a cop, that's the downside of EAP so often. Is I referred a guy to EAP. He went to one session, came back to me and said, I will never do that again. That was the worst experience of my life. I got nothing from it. So it's sometimes I think those peer support groups are the best route to go, because even if they're not the answer, they know what the problems are and they can get you to the answer. So I think
Hmm.
that's incredibly important. I think the reality is that it's your family that's going to notice something before the guys at work notice something. We're very good about putting that wall up. I can't tell you how many guys I've heard about, or personally, an officer that I knew uh, that committed suicide, and you had no idea. You didn't see it. It wasn't even one of these things where, oh, well, that makes sense. We should have seen the signs. Guys, when they get to work, are so good about manning up, guys and girls manning up and being that type A personality and not wanting other officers to see any weakness. So it's incredibly hard. I mean, unless you're sitting car to car and you can tell that a guy's in a bad place, and you have the courage to let him know, hey, or him or her know, hey, I think you're in a bad place and I think you should reach out to this group and refer them to somebody to talk to. um, it's incredibly difficult for us on the job to, and we're always moving, right? We're moving so fast, call to call to call, and especially the busier agencies. And very rarely do you get that one-on-one time where you have the ability to really say, I see something wrong with this guy. So then it comes down to the individual officer to just recognize something's not right and reaching out to a peer group. Again, I bring it back to that trauma, going through a traumatic experience. I've talked to two people that were spent a large portion of their career dealing with child endangerment cases. And every photo, every video is a piece of evidence that somebody has to review. How do those guys carry that around with them for the rest of their lives? And nobody in that unit, there's no check mark like every 6 months you say, hey, we got to get this guy to just have him do a check-in with a doc to make sure he's okay, that this isn't having an impact on him mentally, and that he's good to go. We're not doing that. So these guys are in these positions for 4, 5, 8 years handling these cases, because the reality is not a lot of people want to, not a lot of officers want to do those cases, and you become very good at it, and now you leave the job, and how many hundreds of thousands of images you've seen of this stuff, and you're carrying that with you. So again, institutionally, professionally, as a profession, we need to do a better job of looking out for our people. And in Illinois, there was this bill put forward where there was going to be a mandatory, you had to get a psych eval every year. And it always comes down to numbers, right? The boss says, well, wait a second. What if all of a sudden, because of this, a guy gets put out or a guy can't do the job anymore? We're putting in some respects, we're putting the butt in the seat above the mental well-being of our cops. And it's unfortunate it became voluntary instead of mandatory, but boy, would that have sure, lifted a burden on these guys where now they don't have to voluntarily go to someone, they're required to do it. And that would have made it a lot easier for the profession as a whole, at least in Illinois. So I think we missed an opportunity there.
Yeah. Well, you've heard a lot of stories, and sometimes we take on a responsibility or a burden from hearing these stories. What's it mean for you personally? You've done over 40 interviews. You talked to dozens of cops who probably won't go on camera. How's it affecting you?
I will tell you, people, one of the questions I get all the time is, well, are you going to tell your story? And at some point, I'd love to tell my story, but what happens is the more cops you talk to, the more stories you remember. And I'd be like, man, that'd be like a 6 hour episode. There's just no
Right,
way.
right.
It's not possible. I will say that for me, it's allowed me to stay connected to the community, and it's allowed me to stay connected in a way that I think is of service to these officers. Again, I can't tell you there's a testimonial video that I kind of put out with maybe 10, a dozen officers that I sat down with and interviewed,
Saw
hoping
it.
that if I
Yeah,
show that to guys, they'll watch it.
yeah.
And, you hear these terms where it's this healing and this, it's some closure for them. And I think that really that's what I take away is that sometimes just sitting down and talking to somebody is enough for these officers. It's kind of like, somebody let me tell my story, and I'm good with that. And you put it out there, and 1,000 people watch that story, and your grandkids are going to have that. Your great grandkids are going to have that. It's always going to be out there. So you're kind of leaving that legacy. So I think that's extremely important. Um, my takeaway is there's a lot of hurt out there. I've
Mm.
spent a lot of time talking about it, but there's a lot of hurt out there. And there's some guys and girls, they're doing great. They're doing great. And I don't mean to say that everybody that leaves the job is hurting, but there's enough hurt out there that we got to find a way to help them manage that. But it's been an awesome experience for me, and I think in its own way, it's kind of been cathartic for me as well, because suddenly you realize, oh, this is pretty common to feel like you've lost your identity. It's pretty common to, not being the person that, people go to solve their problems. It's common to miss that. I'm not alone. I'm not weird. It's not odd. And, it helps sitting down and talking to guys and girls that have been a part of the profession.
Yeah. Yeah, my agency will do a 3-day conference in the woods where we talk about all the things affecting you in retirement, including mental health issues, financial issues, marriage issues, things like that. But that happens in like the last year of your on the job, right? And I think that's too late. I think it'd be great 5 years before, maybe in a advanced officers class, having somebody like you or me go and talk to them or play a recording and say, "Hey, look, this is what you can expect." I think within a year is just too short. I know people from my agency who leave and they're like, "What are you going to do?" I got a new fishing pole. I got a set of golf clubs. I've got skis. I got a 4x4. I'm going to do all this stuff. And one of my old commanders, that was his line. I'm going to play so much golf that, people are going to be sick of me at the golf course. About a year later, I see him back carrying files in the hallways, and I'm like, "What are you doing here?" And he was a background investigator, former commander. And that's our rank above captain, just below deputy chief. And he shrugs and he says, "Hey, you can only play so much golf." And I think, maybe there's that unreasonable expectation of people about to retire that I'm going to do this. And I think that in a nutshell says it all. You can only play so much golf. And I remember also early on at the academy, people telling us 3 things you got to avoid in your career: booze, broads, and bad debts, the 3 Bs, right? And then they would say, um, in your retirement, you'll be glad to be done with the job. But no real structure to say, this is what you may feel. This is who you should be talking to. This is how you should start. If you're going to go on to another job, maybe you're going to need some certification or a license or training or something like that. Better to do it 5 years and lead into it than all these things people are experiencing, this shock, this hitting a wall, this, feeling of loneliness and without identity. I think it can be avoided, don't you think?
Yeah, I do. And I got to say something that you brought up of this 3-day retreat. That's incredible. I mean, even if it's in the last year of the job, that's awesome that there's something, because hopefully at least that opens, officers' eyes to what's coming down the track. And when you talk about the guys that, I'm going to golf, I'm going to fish, and a year later you see them back at the department, more likely than not, they don't need the work, they need the
Right,
people.
right.
It's all about the people. They're coming back doing background investigations, not because they love doing background investigations, but because they miss the people and they want to be
Yeah,
around the people. And nobody understands that culture better than cops. And that, the cop culture, you're only getting in one place, and that's in a police department for the most part, unless you're doing those regular retirement breakfasts. But uh, there's definitely ways to manage um, transitioning to retirement and finding a way to feel fulfilled, and maintaining those connections, and holding on to those friendships. And you've got to find a way to do it for sure.
yeah. So I was going to recap all the things that I've already said about all the options that you can have at retirement, but I think one thing I thought of was just finding a mentor, finding if you're an active cop with 5 years to go, find a mentor who's left and they're happy and they're doing something they like. May not be for you, may be totally different than what I mean, some guys are happy being a greeter at Walmart. Nothing wrong with that. Some people do make a life out of fishing and flying ties in the tying flies in the off season, things like that. But I think that's probably your best bet. Or they could listen to podcasts like My Journey with the Badge or
Yeah,
Policing Matters, where we've got over 500 episodes in the archive. I'm sure you'd find something you'd like. I mean, this is a great one. And, I'm going to push it on social media as if you're going to retire in the next 5 years, you got to listen to this. And, I think too often people are one-minded saying, I think I'm going to be fine doing X. And then when plan A fails and they have no plan B, this feeling is inevitable. So
for sure.
I want to thank you for your time, Jason Cates, retired deputy chief, behind My Journey with the Badge. Thanks for what you're doing. I wish you continued success. I'd love to come on your show sometime, talk about my experience as well. Yeah, so much trauma, and I want to share with people that you can pull out of it. There's help out there, and you can occupy yourself and be productive. And I guess my bottom line is it's not always about the bottom line. It doesn't always have to be about a big fat paycheck. Do something that you enjoy. And what's that adage about if you love what you do, it's not work.
I agree. Wholeheartedly agree. And I think that's the key.
Well, thanks, Jason. And I'm going to be checking you out and seeing what you're writing about and who you're talking with. Thanks for being on the show today. Thanks for taking time with us.
Thanks, Jim. I really appreciate it. And thank you for kind of shining the light on My Journey with a Badge. Some great stories. And, I really want them to be heard. These officers deserve to have their stories heard.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, the link is in our show notes, and you can read the extensive bio of Jason Cates. And hey, by the way, we just passed Veterans Day. I want to thank you for your service to our country as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that, Jim.
All right. Well, take good care. And to our listeners, thanks for checking in. Thanks for watching. I hope you check out Jason's website and his podcast. And drop me a line. Let me know what you think. Drop me a line at policingmatters@policeone.com. Love to hear from you. And I'll be sure to uh, give a listen to what you're saying, and maybe we'll turn it into a show. All right. Take good care and hope to talk to you again real soon.